Good evening, friends. Welcome to CEC Gurukul. I am Shankar Kumar. I am a faculty at Hindu College, University of Delhi in the Department of History. And today we are here to talk about the third stage. We are discussing the course of the French Revolution, and we are discussing the third stage of the French Revolution. In the previous interaction that I had with you, we have discussed the nature of the revolution, the historiography weaved around it, and the first couple of stages, that is stage 1 and stage 2, characterized by constitutional phase, you can say National Assembly phase is the first phase, and the second phase as the reign of terror, and this is the subsequent phase that the revolution entered into. And we shall try to see the new social and political base of this stage. We shall also try to gauge the degree of radicalization or the lack of it in this. We will try and find out who are the political outfits who are calling shots in this stage of the revolution, because when you talk of French Revolution, it is not only the incidents characterizing 1789, 1991 and so forth, rather it's a decade-long series of events and turmoil and change and transformation that we have to capture. And that's why in the writings around the revolution, mostly you will find the details categorized in these three stages. And when we say the stage 3 of the revolution, as you can see on your slide, this is also called the Thermidorian reaction and the reign of the Directory. When we say Thermidorian, basically it's the name of a particular month, probably summer season, summer month. And I have discussed with you earlier in my interaction that as part of the second phase, the Jacobins, the sans-culottes, who were calling shots in the second stage, they were not only content with bringing about change in their military strategies and their ways of surveilling people, or redistribution of the confiscated church land, or doing away with feudal privileges and so forth. They rather also entered into the cultural domain and wanted to do away with any vestiges of the past, even in the domain of culture and religion. And as part of the same exercise, they had different or they changed the names of the 12 months in a year, and this was all done in the name of reason. So it's like a legacy of the Enlightenment thinkers that is very much visible here. Although these changes did not last long, and other countries in Europe at times ridiculed this nomenclature change as well. For example, the traditional rivals of the French, the British, ridiculed this change, that this is what you are doing in the name of a revolution, which entailed a lot of blood and transformation and redirection of resources and so forth. Nevertheless, the idea beneath all these changes was to create a new kind of times for themselves, and they were very conscious. The revolutionaries were very conscious of the fact that they have to keep the past behind. And in fact, Abbe Sieyès had once said that today the third state is everything, and past had ceased to guide them into the future. so irrelevant and was the past for them, because so profound were the changes associated with the revolution. Anyway, so coming back to our discussion on the reign of Directory. And Directory here would refer to an executive institution created by the new constitution that we shall be talking about in 1795, where it was manned by 5 people, and they were the ones who headed the executive wing under the National Convention. And National Convention, as I have spoken to you earlier, was mandated to create a new constitution, to draft a new constitution, which they had done during the reign of terror. It was never given a chance to be operationalized, and after the reign of terror had ended, or Robespierre's guillotining had marked almost the end of the reign of terror, another constitution was drafted for France in 1795, and as per that, the executive task was to be vested with this office called Directory, and this was manned by 5 people, and that's how they went about doing their business. Now, let's try and understand as to who were the people and why is it, what marks the end of the reign of terror and beginning of the third stage. When we try and look at this particular issue, we find that during the wartime, during the second stage, France was at war with several neighboring European countries, and to begin with, in 1792, when the war began, the Revolutionary Army, to begin with, had to face some reverses as well. But over the period of time, it started winning wars, and very soon it was clear by around 1793-94 that France was emerging as a triumphant power in the military struggle with the neighboring countries, and the wartime exigencies which formed the pretext for the reign of terror or authoritarian regime and seizing of the liberty and several other human rights. So that logic had lost its relevance with the French army winning most of the wars in 1794-95. Yet, the Committee of Public Safety created by the National Convention, where the Jacobins, the Sansculottes and so forth, they held sway, and it was the combination of radical forces which ensured that despite France winning wars, the wartime measures were not lifted, and this had discredited the efforts made at the behest of the Committee of Public Safety and so forth. This had brought a lot of disrepute to the lofty ideals of the revolution, or the lofty ideals, enlightened ideas with which the revolution had begun. The initial sympathizers were getting alienated even outside France, and the reign of terror and the authoritarian regime, the guillotining, the sheer bloodiness of the regime had brought a lot of disrepute to the ideals with which the revolution had begun, and therefore what we find is that through the provisions like the law of suspects, in the name of protecting the newly created republic, anyone who even betrayed a sense of sympathy for the emigres or the aristocracy or the old regime, or would not appear that radical against them, they were suspected, and without in real terms giving them a fair trial, they were executed or they were guillotined. And this had virtually led to the elimination of the entire battery of French revolutionary leadership. The shining names of Marat, Danton, and finally Robespierre himself, who was such a wonderful speaker and debater, and these are some of the names which had won several revolutionaries, particularly the radical revolutionaries around them, and the sheer imagination of the revolution was tied to these iconic personalities. And as it would have it, during the Reign of Terror, these people who had served on these committees at some point of time or the other fell prey to the same instrument that they were so instrumental in creating and operating with. So, Danton, who was a close associate of Robespierre at one point of time, he was guillotined, and finally even Robespierre was guillotined towards the end of the Reign of Terror. In fact, his guillotining marked the end of the Reign of Terror, and from within the National Convention, people were getting alienated from this revolutionary excesses or radicalism shown by these people. Jacobins had to go into hiding in the subsequent period on account of the excesses that they had done during this period. So, the elimination of this battery of leadership left only the moderates in the convention. I mean, the National Convention was left only with the moderates, and those shining leaders were all gobbled up, consumed by the forces that they themselves had created. So, that's the political scenario towards the middle of 1794, and it is as you can see on your slide, the Committee of Public Safety's demands for continuing self-sacrifice and necessity of terror were not justified in the backdrop of a string of military victories is something that we have discussed already, and this rationale of continuing with wartime measures having gone, it was difficult for them to continue with extraordinary measures like the law of maximum or the Committee of Public Safety or law of suspects and so forth. So, when situation like this emerged, what we find is that the conservatives who were somewhat in hiding, or who were holding who were maintaining a very low profile during the Reign of Terror, during the second stage of the revolution, get an opportunity to come back into the political reckoning, and it is the conservatives who are back in contention in the convention, National Convention. And when they are the ones calling shots in terms of policies and executive decisions, what they did is something that you can see on your slide. Most of the works with which we identify the second phase, that is the law of maximum, the law of suspects, and people taken as prisoners, anyone betraying any sense of sympathy for the old regime or any sense of moderation with respect to the aristocracy or monarchy. They were all taken as prisoners during the Reign of Terror, and all these measures are undone now. The public mood or the political sensibilities have changed, and these have changed on account of two things. One, France winning wars, or French army beginning to win wars against the neighboring countries, which made or which took away the rationale for continuation of excessive measures during the Reign of Terror. And second, of course, was the misuse of these provisions at the cost of public liberty, individualism, fraternity. So, those ideals were set aside for a brief period of 2.5 years during the Reign of Terror. So, all these provisions with which the Reign of Terror was identified, they were done away with. So, the law of maximum, and law of maximum, as I have discussed with you earlier, was some kind of a socialist measure, pro-poor measure, to set the maximum price of articles sold in the market. The essential idea behind this was to cater to the demands of the sans-culottes and the people in the streets of Paris, who were always clamoring for controlled bread prices, bread being an item of essential consumption, daily consumption. And somehow they were not able to, during all through the Reign of Terror, the prices, the spiraling prices were not able to be curbed, yet this provision was there. And it was creating a lot of discomfort to the section of the bourgeoisie, entrepreneurs who wanted to earn profit through their enterprise and so forth. So, these provisions, which had failed to earn results, and yet they were there. So, it was somewhat out of sync with respect to the actual situation, and so the law of maximum is done away with. Similarly, the law of suspects is also gone during this period, during the third stage, and this is because of the excesses done in the name of the suspects. In fact, suspects is a pointer to the fact that anyone who was even suspected of going soft on the conservatives or the monarchists or the older regime, or who were not displaying the required level of radicalism during the Reign of Terror, they were the ones who were targeted, put behind bars, and not given the real fair trial, and very quickly guillotined and done away with. So, that provision, which was a wartime temporary provision, is also done away with during this period. And the political prisoners, as would very logically follow from whatever we are talking about, the political prisoners were freed. So, it is a new regime that we are talking of in the third stage, and it is the conservatives who are important here. It is the bourgeoisie, particularly the upper echelons of bourgeoisie, which is important here. They are the ones who were on the receiving end during the Reign of Terror, or during the second stage. They are back in business. They are the ones who are important in political decision making. The Jacobins, who held sway during the second phase of the revolution, they are driven into hiding. They have to fend for themselves, like the aristocrats or the conservatives or the monarchists had to do during the second phase of the revolution, when Jacobins were on the high, when Jacobins were calling shots. You remember the aristocrats would deliberately remove the royal insignia or any symbol on their houses that announced to public their aristocratic origin or their linkage with aristocracy and so forth. This was all done in the fear, or it was done out of fear from the masses' fury, who would just enter and devastate the buildings and kill people. And this was something which was almost a norm during the Reign of Terror. And therefore, when there is a regime change, when there is a mood change in the political sensibilities in the third phase, we find that it is the Jacobins who are driven into hiding, the radicals who are now into hiding. and the Committee of Public Safety, which was created by the National Convention as the executive organ, which was manned by 12 people, 12 members, and almost all the iconic leaders of the revolution had served this committee at some point of time or the other, although they eventually were guillotined by the same process that they themselves were so instrumental in creating. So, Committee of Public Safety is also divested of all powers, and in its place it is the Directory which is getting the executive power when new elections were held under the new constitution. By and large, as you can see on your slide, when this change happens, it marks the return of priests, royalists, emigres from abroad who had left France during the revolution, fearing their life. They were the ones who were also fomenting the counter-revolutionary sensibilities here in France. So, they are the ones who are back in business, and those emigres are coming back, and that is lending fair degree of weight to the conservative trend that is a characterizing feature of the third stage of the revolution. So, by and large, this constitutes the social profile of the political leadership which is at play in the third stage of the revolution. Now, another lasting contribution, you can say, that is given by the revolutionaries in 1795, which of course is the third stage of the revolution, is the new constitution. So, there is a series of constitutions that the revolutionaries toyed with. There was one constitution right around the time when Bill of Rights was made. Another one was made during the second stage by the National Convention that could never be operationalized, and now you have the third constitution in 1795 by the National Convention. And this constitution had the official approval, you can say stamp of official approval to the victory of the prosperous classes, because the entire social order was supposed to rest on the property, on individual property, or protecting property became the prime duty of the state, and that sums up the public sensibility that was peddling, that was guiding the revolution at around this point of time, and it granted suffrage to all adult male citizens who could read and write. So, any literate person who is an adult was given the right to vote as per this constitution, and this was you can say all in the name of democracy and reaching out to all the citizens of France, although it was confined only to the male citizens and of course adult and literate citizens. However, one need to exercise caution in terms of understanding this particular thing here, that as per the 1795 constitution, there was a provision for there was a provision of bicameral legislature, and voters, I mean the universal franchise that was extended to the voters did not directly lead to the election of members of the legislative body. Rather, voters were to elect what came to be known as electors, and these electors in turn would elect the members of the legislative assembly who would serve the councils in different capacities and so forth. So, the voters were to elect electors, and there was some provision or there was some property qualification for being elected as an elector. So, to stand as a candidate to be elected as an elector, the criteria was, as you can see on your slide, to be the proprietor of an establishment with an annual income not less than 100 days of labor wage. So, the existing labor wage, whatever it was, multiplied by 100, if a particular person had an establishment which had the annual earning up to this point, then only he was entitled to be fielded as a candidate to become an elector, and if he won, he could elect the members of the legislative body. So, here we find there is some property qualification that is important here, and when we say universal suffrage leading to composition of the central legislative assembly and so forth, we need to caution and we need to understand that to begin with there was some rider, and this rider was 100 days of labor wage as the annual income accruing from any establishment that the elector had. So, that itself tells you about the conservative nature of the political dispensation at this point of time, and it is this streak of conservatism which is displayed in several ways. Even the elections that were held and what happened subsequently after what happened subsequent to the elections also displayed fair degree of conservatism that we shall see. So, as part of the provisions under the new constitution, apart from the bicameral legislature with the property qualification for electors, we also have several other provisions that characterize this new constitution in 1795 during the third stage. As you can see on your slide, this time around the citizens were introduced to the idea of duties also. So, in addition to the Bill of Rights with which they were already aware, this constitution of 1795 also introduced the declaration of the duties of the citizens, and therefore, there is an element of what should be done as what should be the obligatory duties of the citizens, that was also enunciated in the 1795 constitution. And the most important thing, as you can see on your slide, and I am quoting from the constitution of 1795, it is upon the maintenance of property that the whole social order rests. Now, this is important. This, you can understand this in the context of a larger debate that is already on in the intellectual climate of Europe. And when you historicize this, you understand that we are talking 1795, the times, the decades following industrial revolution. And in England, of course, this debate is very much live, but this is also influencing other big countries in Europe. So, Adam Smith, the Wealth of Nations, the laissez-faire idea, the free trade idea, and the market, the iron law of the market being endowed with the power to regulate everything, and the state required not to intervene because the market will take care of all the demands and supplies and the values and the prices that different articles and services command and so forth. there is one powerful enunciation of an ideology from Adam Smith's side. On the other hand, subsequently in Europe, we also find a very powerful exposition of socialist idea, which is almost diametrically opposed to the free trade and market principles idea enunciated by Adam Smith, and the you can say the preface of this enunciation of socialist ideas could be seen in the French Revolution itself, and we shall see how the Directory period had to ward off threat not only from the conservative and the monarchist side who wanted the ancient regime to be back, but also from the radical left represented by Babeuf, who is arguing for doing away with private property, individual private property, who is arguing to do away with the parliamentary system or representative system of governance itself, and they are doing so because they believed that these instruments in the name of revolution that have come have not benefited them, the lowest state of society, and they believed that it was a bourgeois instrument, and therefore it needed to be done away with. So the moment we speak about all these things in 1795, it strikes a very uncanny similarity with what Marx had to say several decades subsequent to this, and a formal sophisticated socialist ideas or ideology could be weaved subsequently, but it's you can say initial baby steps are being taken during the course of the revolution itself, and in this context, this particular statement of the 1795 constitution is important, because it says that it is upon the maintenance of property that the whole social order rests, meaning thereby that the entire social order is predicated on maintenance of property, and property being inviolable, property being seen as something that is so basic and almost inborn so far as human existence is concerned, and that cannot and should not be violated. So, the element of contractual agreements and property that are so central to the working of bourgeoisie and to the political ideals of bourgeoisie and so forth, that is something which is given an official constitutional stamp in 1795, and this marked a departure from what the Jacobins had been arguing, or the law of the maximum, or other state intrusion policy measures that was so characteristic of the second phase of the revolution. As you can see on your slide, avoiding monarchy lest the old aristocracy come back to power, the executive authority was vested in a board of 5 men known as the Directory, chosen by the legislative body. So, that sums up the mood of the times. I just told you that this is the phase where the conservatives are back in reckoning, but the revolutionaries who are active, or the people who are active during the revolution at this stage, the bourgeoisie, the entrepreneurs, they are mindful of the fact that they don't have to let France slip into the same old pre-1789 ancient regime. So, there were elements who still had that fascination for monarchy, or those who wanted that monarchy should be brought back to France and there should be a king and things like that. But despite being opposed to the radical excessive measures during the second stage by the Jacobins and Sans-Culottes and so forth, the people even in the third stage are mindful to the extent that they have to avoid France slipping into monarchical mode again. And therefore, the old feudal regime or aristocracy is kept at bay, and they are not let into, or their entry into the or their access to the levers of power is restricted, at times even by resorting to several schemes, and that is something that we shall see. And so, what happens here is that the National Convention creates another executive authority by the name of Directory, and 5 people were supposed to be on the board of this Directory, and these people were to be chosen by the legislative body. And so, this is the executive structure created by the new constitution, which did the executive work in France from here on. Now, during the reign of Directory, what we find that it is essentially the handiwork of the newly become rich people, nouveau riches. They were speculators, they were wartime profiteers, and therefore, they did not quite display the kind of sophistication that is associated with wealthy people, or that France was so socialized with. And since they were the first generation wealth acquirers, therefore, there was fair degree of ostentatiousness and vulgarity associated with their behavior pattern, and they were at times lampooned for this. So, the conservatives or the royalists, monarchists at times looked down upon this social class which was calling shots during the period of Directory, and their one time wealth acquisition is something that is coming for a lot of ridicule during this period. Yet they somehow continued to have access to the levers of power during this phase, and they were successful in warding off the monarchists or the feudal aristocratic elements to come near to the levers of power. So, as you can see on your slide, these people, despite all the handicaps or the fact that they had recently become rich, these people were not ready to see the major accomplishments of the revolution undone. And if you have a little bit of future perspective, or if you look at these things with the advantage of hindsight, because several years away from 1795 is Napoleon coming into power, and when we discuss Napoleon, we do talk about whether he was a child of the revolution or not. Had the revolution not been there, was it possible for someone like Napoleon to rise to the military post and position that he did, which ultimately led to him becoming the emperor? So, such things were an impossibility in the old regime, and it is this tenacity with which they held on to the revolutionary spirit that they saw to it that the accomplishments of the revolution are not completely undone, although they did well to do away with the excesses that were carried out during the reign of terror, and that we have already spoken about. So, if we look at the working of the directory in terms of their accomplishments and their political attainments, well, prices or rising prices something that couldn't be contained even under the rule of directory, and since prices were not controlled, particularly of the essential items, therefore, there was always this scope of the unrest among the lower orders, who earlier were represented by the sans-culottes and their political outfit in the form of Jacobins and so forth. So, there was always this possibility that the radical elements could get some rationale to come back into the reckoning, and therefore, at this point of time we find that the leftist threat is gaining some bit of momentum under Babev, who probably was some historians regard him as a mythical figure, but he could be historical as well. And he in 1796 launched a campaign to abolish private property and parliamentary government, because as I just now discussed, that these parliamentary institutions in the name of representative institutions, although it sounded that they were representative, but the lower order believed that their concern is not being articulated by these parliamentarians, and hence it is the apparatus of the bourgeoisie to perpetuate and further their interest that such parliamentary institutions are created, and therefore they wanted the parliamentary system of governance also to go, and they wanted the private property also to go, so that no one could bequeath property to their progeny, and that should have created scope of massive redistribution of property that the nation had. And this is like a socialist ideology that is being talked about here under the leadership of Babev. If you look at the directory during this point of time, then we find that the challenge was not coming only from the left. In fact, as I have also discussed earlier, that the conservatives are equally back into reckoning at this point of time, and the rightist threat is something which is more profound here, because in the elections that were held or as per the new constitution, and this was the first ever fair election that was held. Now, here we find that the anti-monarchists and the army, their help is taken by the directory officials to annul the threat that is coming from the right. So, the conservatives are also effectively taken care of, and the 1797 elections that I just spoke to you about, in fact, you can see on your slide that these were 1797 elections were the first free elections in Republican France, and it returned a large number of constitutional monarchists to the Council of Government. So, the public mood on account of the continued excesses of the reign of terror had given some kind of space, or the charm of the monarchy was something that the people were lapping up to, and therefore, in these elections a good number of the representatives who ultimately got elected were constitutional monarchists. They did not come from the radical profile of the leadership, rather they came from the conservative profile of the French politics. and this was a big threat to the continuance of the Directory officials, and the Directory officials ensured that like they warded off the leftist threat by Babeuf, similarly they took the help of the anti-monarchist elements in France and also the army to quell the threat posed by the constitutional monarchists who had returned as a consequence of the first fair elections in Republican France in a good number. And how did they do this? They did this by a series of purges, uprisings and continued inflation that followed this, and in fact the election results were artificially tweaked to continue their power, to continue the power of the Directory, to continue the rule of the Directory, and therefore the situation was getting almost out of control. The normative life was deeply impacted. So the period from 1797 to 1799 is the period characterized by a series of purges, uprisings. Inflation could not be contained, and that added fuel to the leftist threat, and there is fair degree of you can say anomie, normlessness in France, and you discover that this kind of a situation is the classic situation for the emergence of some charismatic leader who I mean this yearning of France for a charismatic leader was answered in the form of Napoleon, who in 1799, 18th Brumaire, we shall be talking about it maybe sometime later when I get chance to meet you again, because this Directory period has not been able to meet the mandate that is it was required to, and France the perpetual problems of spiraling prices and the social unrest that was triggered on account of the revolution that had not ebbed, that had not stopped, and therefore either in the form of some long lasting institution or in the name or in the form of some charismatic leader, it had to be answered. So if we look at the entire revolution as a whole and try and put things in perspectives, what emerges out of this discussion on French Revolution all through its three stages is that it's one thing that the revolutionaries were very inspired and they were virtually unanimous in detesting the ancient regime or the severance with past that they had envisaged was almost total, but a revolution or a French Revolution, like quite a few other revolutions, but not all, was not very clear in terms of what they were going to create as the new regime. So the blueprint of the future of France was not ready, and all through the revolution we find that it was contingent on the most vociferous group at one point of time, replaced by some other group at another point of time, those who could lay parliamentary proceedings to hostage like sans-culotte and so forth, because when you see their modus operandi, you realize that when the deputies are entering the National Assembly, that's where they lay siege, that's where they are picketing, and making slogans and trying to bring the deputies' spirit down, clamoring for demands which are essentially sectional. So that's how the second phase went. Whereas when we find the revolution entering the third phase, it is again the newly become rich people from amongst the bourgeoisie. They are back in reckoning. Monarchists are back, but or conservatives are back, but they somehow are not given access to the levers of power by some scheme and by manipulation and so forth. When elections are held, free and fair elections are held, they return a large number of constitutional monarchists, but they are not allowed to have a field day. They are not allowed to operate, because again the directory is ensuring that they perpetuate their own power through scheme and mechanizations and tweaking things here and there, taking the help of the army and manipulating public opinion and presenting a charismatic leader in the form of Napoleon, so forth. So French Revolution, in terms of its blueprint for the future, is appearing to be quite ambivalent, and it is contingent to several factors. It is contingent to several circumstances, several social groups, and it took fair amount of time for France to stabilize into the future. But one thing was sure, which is a lasting contribution of the French Revolution, that they had done away with the ancient regime, the feudal regime, and their severance with past at times appeared very vehement, even in the domain of culture. That proved to be short-lived, but their severance with past was total, and it was not allowed to relapse until the Congress of Vienna 1814-1815 wanted it to come back to the same pre-1789 situation, which it could never come back, and the progressive forces that it had unleashed went on to shape the future of France and also Europe in the times to come. Thank you.